YouTubers who were a missing person. What's your story? Story 1. Not me, but my brother was missing for around a year. He disappeared before, but only for a few days. He suffers from paranoid schizophrenia and would often get delusional. But this time he didn't turn up. We live in NYC, and my parents had no idea where to look for him. They'd regularly go to the police station and look at pictures of bodies that had turned up. He didn't have any friends or girlfriends we could ask about him. He had just vanished. A year later, we got a call from a hospital in DC. My brother had been picked up on the street, nearly dead from malnutrition. He'd gone to Washington to warn the government about something or other. He often refused to eat, believing his food was poisonous, and lived on the streets for a year. The only reason he survived was because other homeless people took care of him and convinced him to occasionally eat something. He was a skeleton when they found him, full of flea bites. Eventually, my parents nursed him back to health. He's still mentally ill, but hasn't tried to disappear again. I think about him whenever I see a homeless person. Story 2. It was my first day in kindergarten. I was supposed to go to the after-school daycare, but I lost the note saying I was supposed to. So the teacher shoved me on the bus and told the bus driver where I lived. Not sure if that's actually how it went down, but regardless, they made me leave. The bus dropped a little 5-year-old me off at home. All the doors are locked, and my mother wouldn't even get out of work for another 2 to 3 hours. So I do what any little kid does. I sit on my front porch and cry. Luckily, I lived right across the street from the high school, and this angel of a woman saw me from the bleachers while a soccer game was going on. She comes over to check on me and stays with me the entire time. Meanwhile, at the school, the staff is going crazy because I'm nowhere to be found. My mother was called, and as I'm told, crying profusely. Then, out of the blue, I see this 1960s brown Cadillac pull up and overwalk my principal. He thanks the women for taking care of me and brings me back to the school. Because of my situation, they suspended my teacher and the bus driver, and I never do anything without proper paperwork. Story 3. My mother was on the phone with the police after I fell asleep in a cemetery for 7 hours after school. I had a shit home life, so I'd be anywhere and everywhere I could be to not go home. Beginning of the school year was still really nice outside, so I decided to hit the Dunkin' Donuts near my house, grab some coffee, and I walked to the cemetery that was maybe 10 minutes walk from my house. There was a really nice mausoleum in the cemetery, which happened to be the structure at the highest point in the city. So you can, on a clear day, see about 15 miles. I chilled there for a while, just kinda thinking. About 300 feet away is a statue of Jesus on the cross with other figures. I was kinda tired, so I laid a little ways away from it, just enough to get some shade, not enough to be laying on it. And I listened to music until I passed out. Woke up a few hours later, figured, F it, might as well go home, and my mother started losing her shit. He just walked in, I'm so sorry. WRETEF, but who are you? I left and went back to the cemetery. Story 4. I was reported missing for a few days because I ran away from home at 16. I ran away with my 17-year-old boyfriend, who was not reported missing by his parents. My parents had read through some of my chat messages. I had a habit of saving logs and knew I was likely heading north or west, but weren't sure. Thankfully, since I was listed as missing, and they knew who I was with, the guy was being monitored, and he used his debit card on the way, so they had an idea where I'd be. Cops came with a search warrant to the place we were staying a couple hours before we were going to head off west. We already had a new car ready to go, with some cash, to make it harder to be tracked. We're gonna leave later that night. I'm very lucky. If we'd taken off before the cops found me, there's a more than decent chance I'd have stayed missing and life would have been very, very bad. I married the guy a couple months later, and he was an abusive asshole. His manipulations and isolation of me were a huge factor in the running away also. I had a decent stay at a sheep farm while a ward of the state, waiting for my parents to arrive and get me. That was neat. Then I got home and a family friend came over to scream at me about how I was trying to murder her daughter and that I was a disgrace. Not so neat. Story 5. Not that interesting, but I was 14 and I decided to walk to my then boyfriend's house, which was an hour away walking, but I thought I could do it since it was still in the same city. Anyway, I sneak out the front door while everyone's asleep, and I almost got kidnapped. Some guy pulled up in his car on the side of the street where I was walking. There was no sidewalk, so I was on the shoulder, and I made the ugliest double chin face I could make and picked up a rock trying to make myself look super ugly so I wouldn't get kidnapped, and I just stood there with my double chin until he finally drove off. I kept walking. It's maybe 25 minutes later, and I've now found myself passing nightclubs, and so many people outside drunk, and in short revealing clothes. That's when I got scared and went up to 2 policemen I saw in the corner. I told them I needed a ride home, and they asked for my info. I gave them my address and name. They looked me up on their computer and found out there was a missing person report out on me. When they dropped me off in front of my door, my mom was up, my sister, my aunt, and uncle and cousins were there. It was the most embarrassing moment of my life, and I never snuck out again. Story 6. I have a story, and it's actually about me. When I was 7 years old, everyone in my family got the flu pretty bad. My 2 younger sisters and I all shared a room adjacent to my parents, and my baby brother was sleeping in my parents' bed. Well, because of the illness, my 2 younger sisters were also sleeping in my parents' bed. At around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up and realized I was the only person sleeping in my room. Not wanting to be alone, I crawled into my parents' room and saw everyone cuddled on the bed. Feeling incredibly jealous, I turned to go back to my room, but had a light bulb moment and figured out another solution. I bundled down to the bottom of the covers at the foot of the bed, completely covered. Around 2:15, my mother woke up to check on me, as mothers do. I wasn't there. Unusual. She checks for me in her bed, husband, and 3 visible children. She goes downstairs and checks to see if I'm sleeping on a sofa or in one of the 2 guest bedrooms. We have one door in our house that's tricky and will sometimes swing open on its own accord. The door was open. Check both bathrooms. Still no sign. At around 2:30, she woke up my father. It was early February and therefore quite cold out. My parents walked around outside and they saw my footprints all around the house. However, I had been outside earlier that day and it hasn't snowed in a few weeks. My parents were afraid I had become delirious and wandered outside in the cold or worse. So after some heated discussion, they first called the police and then our babysitter to watch the rest of the kids. In about 10 minutes, the entire police force of our tiny town is in our living room. They have lit up all 16 acres of our property with floodlights and have lifted up a chopper in the county to start a search. All of my siblings were woken up and moved to the living room with the babysitter. Funnily enough, this is actually my youngest sister's earliest memory. The chief of police said they were going to crack search the house and started in my parents' bedroom. Naturally, the first thing they did was take the covers off the bed. The only thing I remember is being woken up by a police officer shining the light in my face and rudely ripping the covers off me. I was incredibly annoyed. Naturally, my parents were incredibly apologetic, but the officers were very good-natured and said not to worry about it, and that this was definitely the preferred outcome. About 5 months later, my father and I went to the local fire hall's annual fundraiser and performed a few songs that my dad had me learn specifically for this occasion, and he told the story of what happened to me that night, thanking the first responders for their quick action and good attitude. I think we donated some money, but honestly, I have no idea. I was slightly embarrassed because everyone was picking on me, but flattered enough by the fact that I got to sing for all of the adults that I didn't mind. That's probably the fastest way I've ever spent your hard-earned tax dollars. You're welcome. Story 7. After a long period of estrangement, I went to visit my mother and father. This was after a long drive, and I was quite tired. My mother decided it was the perfect opportunity to berate me. I tried to leave, and she blocked my car physically so she could continue to berate me. I just left my car in the driveway and walked to a nearby hotel. I stayed there for a couple days, went back, and got my car without seeing them, and drove back home. A few years later, I Googled myself as I was up for a job and wanted to make sure there wasn't anything stupid on the internet about me. I found out they reported me missing. I called the government and got it removed. Story 8. I became a missing person during my first sexual experience. Family vacation. I was about 12 at the time. My parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents all got together for a big camping expedition. I met a couple of girls at the swimming pool and they suggested I sneak into their tent that night at midnight to play truth or dare. My parents, my brother and myself all shared one big tent. Everyone went to bed early that night except for me. All I could think about was finally touching a breast, and that was more than enough to keep me awake. Finally, at midnight, I slowly creeped over to the tent exit and started to unzip it. And of course, that's when my mom woke up. She asked what I was doing. I told her I had to take a shit, so she handed me a roll of toilet paper, and I thought, went back to sleep. I threw the toilet paper in the bushes and went on my merry way to tame some strange. Fast forward over 2 hours later, I had made out with a girl for the first time, touched a few breasts, even rounded second base, and was feeling pretty good about myself. We noticed there were cars driving all around slowly, which was unusual being as late as it was. I decided to head back, just in case my mom noticed I was gone. I walk over a hill, still sporting a massive and obvious erection, only to be greeted by my entire extended family and about 6 cops. Turns out my mom heard a car speed off just after I said I was going to take a shit, found the toilet paper I threw, and assumed I had been kidnapped. The cops told me they were about to put together a search party complete with canines. Everyone's crying and angry at me. I think the worst was when my grandfather, who was always a very reserved man, looked me dead in the eye and asked if I realized how utterly disappointed he was in me. Instant boner killer. I never did see those girls again. Story 9. I was 9 and sometimes I would walk home after school. Sometimes my mom would come pick me up. One day I was invited to go to my friend's house down the block to work on a school project, and I called home from the school phone to see if that was okay. The line was busy, so I kept calling for nearly half an hour and couldn't get through. I started walking toward my friend's house on the same route I would normally walk home, hoping my mom would pass me. I was also thinking maybe I had mixed up my days because my mom hadn't come to get me. I told the office workers I was going to walk to my friend's house and to let my mom know I had been calling since school got out. It took me about 15 minutes to walk there, and I started calling my mom again. For the next hour, the line kept going to a busy signal. I was getting really worried by that point. So I left, and on the way home a family friend saw me and said my mom had reported that I was missing. In the 15 minutes it had taken me to get to my friend's house, she had gotten off the phone with whoever she was talking to, driven to the school, didn't see me, waited a few minutes, then drove home and started calling the police, my dad, and anyone else she could think of to help look for me. It never occurred to her to ask any of the school staff if they had seen me, or to get off the phone for a few minutes in case I, or anyone else, was trying to call. The police even scolded her for tying up the line after they told her to keep it clear. Story 10. I was never filed as missing, but it could have definitely happened. When I was 4 years old, we were having a nice family vacation in the mountains. There was this thing called Baby Club, where parents staying at the hotel could leave their children to be cared for while they did their stuff. So my parents left me and my 7-year-old sister with them. The Baby Club took us to a nearby ice rink. Back then, I was an extremely quiet kid, so they kind of forgot about me sitting on the bleachers and went back to the hotel. My sister at first didn't realize that I wasn't with them. You know, she was only 7 years old. She was preoccupied with playing with the other kids. But after a while she realized that I wasn't there and told the baby club people, "Hey, so where's my sister?" Cue general panic. My parents were extremely worried. It was cold. I was 4 years old and alone. They didn't know what to do. And since I was so young, I could have been stupid enough to try to walk alone from the ice rink to the hotel. And it was quite far, especially for such a small kid. While they were panicking, I had enlisted the help of a random adult. The details get fuzzy. I was told the story by my sister and parents. I was too young to remember, but he asked me why I was there alone, and I told him they'd forgotten me. Then I told him my hotel, the room number, and my parents' name. He let me piggyback him and took me back. So there we were, a few hours later. 4 years old me piggybacking on the back of a really tall blonde stranger. My parents were so relieved they didn't even sue the place. It could have gone so wrong. I could have died in the snow. I could have been kidnapped. That really nice man could have been not so nice. I could have forgotten the hotel name and remembered. To this day, I have no idea how I managed to remember that. I have a really shitty memory. So, thank you, friendly giant man. I would have probably died without you.